She didn't just respond, she allegedly tried to shut it down. And that's where this whole situation starts to feel different.
She's doing a CIA informational video.
Is
Weird.
that like an acting gig, or is this something else?
Perhaps, or,
I know, I'm just
but
asking.
even so, you're doing an acting gig for the CIA. Who calls you for that?
Because when someone goes from ignoring rumors to pushing back hard, especially behind the scenes, that's usually the moment people start asking even more questions, not fewer. And now, somehow, Joe Rogan has been pulled directly into the middle of it. What started as another conversation on his podcast has quickly turned into something much bigger.
A reality TV show, a romance one at that. He met her on a trip to Israel.
There's a video of her making demon eyes, and every time she makes the eyes, the music.
After weeks of speculation surrounding Erika Kirk and her past, Joe finally addressed one of the most controversial ideas that's been circulating online: the claim that her role in Charlie's life may not have been as simple as it seemed. Not just a relationship, not just coincidence, but something more structured, something that people have been referring to as a handler. Now, that word alone has changed the entire tone of the conversation, because it doesn't just suggest influence, it suggests intent. And once that idea enters the discussion, everything else starts to get re-examined through a completely different lens. But what made this situation escalate so quickly wasn't just that Joe brought it up. It's what allegedly happened after. Because according to what's now being discussed across multiple platforms, Erika didn't just brush it off or let it fade away like most public figures would. Instead, the claim is that there was a response behind the scenes, one that involved concerns about how she was being portrayed and, more importantly, where the conversation was heading. Now, to be clear, none of that has been officially confirmed, but it's being repeated enough that people are starting to treat it as part of the broader narrative. And that's where things start to shift. Because whether the response was real, exaggerated, or completely misunderstood, it adds a new layer to the story, a layer that revolves around control. Because here's the question people keep coming back to: if the claims are completely unfounded, why react so strongly? Why not ignore it and let it pass? That's what most people in the public eye tend to do.
She's a kook for sure.
You ever seen the compilation of her making crazy eyes?
No.
There's a video of her making demon eyes, and every time she makes the eyes, the music.
Claim is that there was a response behind the scenes, one that involved concerns about how she was being portrayed and, more importantly, where the conversation was heading. Now, to be clear, none of that has been officially confirmed, but it's being repeated enough that people are starting to treat it as part of the broader narrative. And that's where things start to shift. Because whether the response was real, exaggerated, or completely misunderstood, it adds a new layer to the story, a layer that revolves around control. Because here's the question people keep coming back to: if the claims are completely unfounded, why react so strongly? Why not ignore it and let it pass? That's what most people in the public eye tend to do when rumors don't hold weight. But in this case, the reaction, at least the one being described, feels different. And that difference is what's fueling the conversation. Because when Joe talked about it, he didn't come across like someone making a bold accusation. If anything, he sounded like someone noticing patterns, small details, moments that didn't quite line up, things that, individually, might not mean much, but when placed next to each other start to raise questions. And that's really how this entire situation has been building, not through one major reveal, but through a series of smaller observations that slowly start to form a bigger picture. And once people start seeing that picture, it becomes very hard to unsee. That's exactly what happened after Joe's comments started circulating. Clips were shared, segments were replayed, and suddenly, more people were looking at the same details, but from a completely different perspective. At the same time, Candace Owens also entered the conversation, and she didn't exactly dismiss the idea. Instead, she approached it the same way she has been approaching this entire situation, by laying out pieces of information, connecting certain dots, and then stepping back, just enough to let the audience come to their own conclusions, which, If you've been following this story at all, you already know tends to have a very specific effect. It doesn't close the conversation.
Prayer. And we asked the Lord to protect us.
The students, and I was standing in the ticket line. We'll meet for dinner.
No, of course. But we serve a just God. And I rest easy in knowing that He's sovereign, but He's just. And so let the Lord handle that. Burn the city down. March in the streets.
And of God's merciful love. To stop.
Points to something more intentional, something that goes beyond normal media training. Now, again, none of that is confirmed, but it's part of the conversation. And Joe touched on that as well. Not as a conclusion, but as an observation, which is exactly why it resonated. Because it didn't feel like a theory being pushed. It felt like something being noticed in real time, and that's often what carries the most weight. Because when something feels organic, people trust it more, even if it's still just a question. But then the conversation took another turn. Because shortly after that episode gained traction, the narrative began to shift from what was said to whether it should have been said at all. That's when the idea started circulating that Joe might have crossed into territory that certain people would prefer to keep untouched, and that's where the alleged warning comes in.
Forward to the Israel firsters' frustrations is the fact that everybody can see that something's not right with Turning Point USA and Erika Kirk, and that includes the biggest podcaster in the world, Joe Rogan. They were so angry because he went on his show and just kind of said... Candace also because a documentary because they came out and they were suddenly trying to gaslight us and were, the CIA didn't produce the documentary. Okay, yes, but the head of the CIA is in it. Okay, you got to get approval from the CIA to be in a CIA documentary. That doesn't just happen casually. Like he says, are you getting that phone call from your agent? And no, she's not acting. She's specifically referring to her mother's business model. So she's not acting. She's involved. And so people, of course, online were so angry about it. The Israel Firsters, Mark Levin, tweeted this. Is this some AI production? If not, what a total disgrace. Then this Eitan Fishberger said, this is some sick stuff from Joe Rogan, as if Erika hasn't been through enough already. How about just acknowledging that you do not have the power to transform reality?
Associated with the concept of being warned or pressured. That alone is enough to make people pause, because it introduces a completely new dimension: power, influence, control. And once those elements enter the conversation, everything else begins to shift around them. Suddenly, it's not just about whether a claim is true or false. It becomes about who gets to decide what can be discussed and what can't. And that's where this story starts to feel bigger than just one person or one podcast episode. Because now, people are paying attention to patterns. Which claims get ignored, which ones get addressed, and which ones, according to the narrative, trigger stronger reactions behind the scenes. And when you line those up, some people believe they start to see a pattern forming. Now, that doesn't prove anything on its own, but it keeps the conversation alive. Because at its core, this situation isn't being driven by answers. It's being driven by questions. And the more questions that get asked, the more attention it attracts. That's why this hasn't faded away. If anything, it's gaining momentum, because now it's no longer limited to smaller online discussions. With voices like Joe Rogan and Candace Owens involved, it's reached a level where more people are being exposed to it at the same time. And when that happens, the stakes change, because once a conversation reaches that scale, it becomes much harder to control, much harder to contain. And that's exactly what some people believe is happening right now, that the narrative is starting to move faster than anyone expected, that too many people are looking into it simultaneously, and that the more attention it receives, the more difficult it becomes to manage. But even with all of that, there are still gaps, details that don't fully connect, timelines that feel incomplete, moments that could be interpreted in multiple ways depending on how you look at them. And that's why people keep coming back to this story, trying to understand it, trying to separate what's confirmed from what's assumed, and trying to figure out whether there's something deeper beneath the surface, or if it's all just speculation building on top of itself. Because right now, it could go either way. And that uncertainty is what keeps people watching. Because if there's one thing that's clear, it's this. The story isn't finished, not even close, and whether Joe intended to or not, his comments may have pushed it into a new phase, a phase where more people are paying attention, where more questions are being asked, and where the next development could shift the entire narrative again. So now, the focus turns to what happens next. Does Joe address it again? Does Erika respond publicly? Or does everything go quiet, at least for a while, before something new surfaces? Because if this pattern continues, that's usually how it unfolds. A moment of silence, followed by another wave, another clip, another claim, the reaction, the pushback, the questions that followed, because in situations like this, those reactions often reveal more than the original statement ever could. And that's exactly why people aren't letting this go. They're watching closely, waiting to see what happens next. Because in stories like this, the next move usually says everything. So, what do you think? Is this just another case of speculation spiraling out of control? Or is there something here that people are only just beginning to notice? Let me know your thoughts below. And if you've been following this situation, share this with someone who hasn't seen the latest developments yet. Because this one feels like it's far from over.